Hello guys, welcome to the fiction series. Today we are gonna see, what if Naruto got harem with Harem Hinata, Anko, Ino and Yui. Part 2. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So without wasting any time, let's get into the video. Shanks paused that night. I sighed as I leaned against a tree, looking down at Naruto as he sat away at his own small fire. Damn, I felt a small spike of his haki and come all the way out here for nothing. I rested my arm back on my sword and nodded before I turned, feeling the Anbu around me. I didn't feel any hate toward Naruto or Anko. Well, I guess it's okay to leave them be for now. I turned and stopped when I felt a dozen life energies vanish. I looked back to the village and nodded before I used the Hiruzen again. I appeared in the center of the village and felt around again. 4 more vanished. The Uchiha compound. I jumped, heading for the Uchiha compound. Lord Shanks. I looked back as I jumped across a rooftop. I stopped just outside the Uchiha compound as more plain masked Anbu surrounded me with swords drawn. I don't have time for all of you. I blasted them all with my Conqueror's Haki. They all dropped and I felt another 4 groups pass out. Before I moved on, I pulled out a live body sealing scroll and grabbed the closest Anbu to me. I saw a seal on the back of his neck and frowned. I slammed an anti on the back of his neck. It would deactivate all the seals on his body. I sealed his body inside the scroll before I jumped over the wall of the Uchiha compound and stopped seeing the bodies. I looked around and reached out with my observation haki. I felt maybe 50 of the 200 Uchiha were gone. I felt around and smiled as I sensed 2 powerful chakra signatures coming toward me. Let's get some backup. I pulled out a red enemy flare. I pulled a string in my teeth and sent a red flare into the air. Lord Shanks. I turned and saw Sasuke's and Yui's mother, with a few other Uchiha Kunoichi with blood on her clothes and a large group of kids. She had a sword in her hand. I did a quick count and she had 30 kids and 6 other Kunoichis. 2 in the back were wounded and I frowned. Before I could respond, Hiruzen appeared with 30 Anbu around him. What is going here, Shanks? Someone is killing the Uchiha. I sensed 2 powerful chakra signatures come my way before they call out to me. They vanished after that. My guess, the reinforcement flare made it seem like more trouble than they were ready for. Hiruzen nodded before he looked at the Anbu. Spread out and get a count of the survivors. They vanished and I sighed before I looked back and saw that she was looking around. Are you okay? She nodded as she looked at me. My sons weren't home. I don't know where they are. I frowned before nodding. I created a shadow clone and he nodded before he jumped off. My clone will look for Sasuke and I think your other son was Itachi, right? Yes, thank you, Lord Shanks. I nodded before I waved for them to follow me. Come on, Tsunade and Shizune are at home and I have a powerful barrier around my clan compound. Lady Mikoto, I think it is best if you go with him. Lord Shanks' seals never fail and he's as strong as Kage. I nodded to Hiruzen before we started to move. Mikoto walked up beside me and I saw she had a dark look in her eyes. I can't just leave her be like thing. I cleared my throat, getting her attention. When they deal with everything, I'll take some time to help set up a barrier around the Uchiha compound, or I can talk with the council about letting your clan move to a safer part of the village. She smiled up at me. Thank you for your help, Lord Shanks. I nodded as we walked down the street. I stopped when I sensed one of the signatures appeared behind us. I turned, drawing my sword as a Kunoichi blocked a sword stick with a masked man. I caught my sword in haki and jumped at him. Move. The barrier is down, tell Tsunade to activate the barrier. They did as I told them as the masked man jumped back. I heard them start to run and I blocked the man's path. He laughed before he jumped at me with his sword raised to stab at me. I threw my sword up as he thrusted his sword forward. I smiled when my sword broke his in 2. I caught my foot, then kicked him hard in the ribs. I felt his lower ribs give way before he flew back from the impact. He skipped over the ground a few times before he slammed into the side of a building. Madara. I looked up and saw another Uchiha holding a badly bleeding arm. I felt my shadow clones dispel and I tightened my grip on my sword as I looked at him. You little bastard. You turned on your own clan. You murdered your own father. He frowned as he looked at me. Lord Shanks, you know nothing of what happened tonight. I'm only glad my younger sister and brother didn't have to see this. I frowned before a swirl sucked him and I blinked before I looked back at the man I just kicked. He swirled away and I frowned before I remembered the kids. I Hiruzen into the compound and I saw Tsunade and Shizune treating a few of the kids. I saw a dog masked Anbu with a woman cat masked Anbu standing inside the compound. I ran over to them. They looked at me as I sheathed my sword. You two, I encountered one of the attacks. One was Itachi Uchiha and the other was a man in a black cloak with an orange swirl mask. I need one of you to talk that message to Lord Hokage. The dog nodded his head. I'll be back, face cat. He shunshin away and I looked over to Tsunade. She looked at Shanks as she stood up from the kid sitting on the edge of the porch. "Hime." She looked at me and quickly ran over to me. She held onto the back of my cape. I wrapped my arm around her. "These are kids. What kind of monster attacks kids?" I frowned, then laughed a little. "Well, I encountered one of those monsters. I managed to break his lower ribs before he got away from me." She laughed a little before she turned her head and looked at the kids again. Luckily I didn't get my hands on him." I nodded and patted her back before Dog reappeared. Mikoto walked up beside us and put a hand on my arm. I felt Tsunade tighten her arms around me. "Lord Third thanked you for the information, Lord Shanks. But the Shinobi Council has called for a meeting. Lady Tsunade, I was told you were to remain here to act as a deterrent on another attack. Squad of elite Anbu have taken up positions around the compound to protect the survivors, taking Shither here. Lady Mikoto, as your husband is dead, you must take back the seat of head of the clan." Mikoto nodded before Tsunade gave me a quick kiss on my lips before I patted Mikoto's shoulder. She looked up at me and I smiled. "Don't worry, I will be more than happy to add the seals first thing tomorrow morning." A small smile graced her face as she looked up at me. "Thank you, Lord Shanks." Dog grabbed our shoulders and shunshin us into the council room. Mikoto quickly walked over to the Shinobi Council seats. I walked over and leaned on the wall before I pulled the body scroll out. "Lord Shanks, what do you have there?" I smiled as I looked at Danzo after he spoke to me. He looked a little worried as he looked at me. "You'll see, you old plain masked warhawk, once the Hokage arrives." His visible eye opened, and before it narrowed, my seal to blocking control activated on my right bicep. I looked right at Danzo and spoke in a dark tone in my voice. "Whoever is trying to control my mind, I have a level 10 mental attacking blocking seal on mine and everyone in my house." A deep frown crossed Danzo's face before my seal was deactivated. I smiled as I tapped the scroll on my thigh while I looked at Danzo with a smile on my face. He only glared back at me. A few moments passed before Hiruzen walked in, still in his battle gear, with a look that could kill. He walked over to his desk and sat down in his chair, giving off a massive amount of kai as he glared at Danzo. I laughed as he looked at Danzo as he sweated. "Lord Shanks." I looked away from Danzo and laughed as I looked fully at his rage-filled eyes of Hiruzen as he looked at Danzo. He glared at him for a moment longer before I threw the scroll over to him. Hiruzen caught the scroll and looked at me. The live body sealing scroll. I caught a plain mask Anbu and put a powerful deactivation seal on the man after seeing a seal on the back of his neck. It forcibly shuts down all the seals on a body. The group he was with tried to stop me from getting into the Uchiha compound when I felt the life forces start to disappear. "See, Ibiki will have a lot of fun with this one." I looked back to see all the elders sweating as they looked between Hiruzen and me. "I suggest you, or Tsunade be there. I have a feeling someone will try something." "So, does anyone know the casualties of the Uchiha clan?" Hiruzen sighed as he leaned back into his chair. "Yes, all the Uchiha with fully matured Sharingan were killed. All the elemental masters were killed as well. As well had the former head of the clan Fugaku Uchiha and his eye were taken." I blinked and was a little shaken at that. "He eyes were taken," I snapped, sacring everyone and slammed my fist into the wall and sent spider web cracks on the wall. I ignored their look at Tsum as she tried to talk to me. "You crimson-eyed bastard, you turn on your own and steal your father's eyes." Tsum fell silent and I looked back at Hiruzen. The aged man flinched a little as I looked at him. "When he breaking, I want names. Everyone involved will feel the wrath of the Uzumaki elder that killed the former second Raikage and nearly the third Raikage. I slaughtered more than 600 ninjas that day, Hiruzen. Whoever planned this, they attacked the children too. With everything they'd done tonight, it will look like child's play when I get my hand on them." I saw everyone but Hiruzen shake in fear as I just let my anger and rage fill the air. The civilian had passed and the clan head looked wholly terrified, but when I looked at Tsum and Mikoto, I saw faint blushes on their faces as they shook. Naruto's POV 2 days later. I walked in front of Anko and Yui. I looked at them out of the corner of my eye. They looked worried as they looked at me. I sighed before I stopped. I walked back onto the main road to the village. I'd spent the last 2 days not really speaking to the two of them outside of training. I leaned on a tree with my arms and looked at the two. They stopped as they looked at me. I know I've been cold, but it was needed. I'm sick of being jumped on or dragged around by my collar. Plus, the fact being spied on isn't fun either. I looked at Anko and she laughed as she rubbed the back of her head. Yui blushed as she looked the other way. "Yeah, we're bad about those two things." I nodded as I looked at Anko. "But none of you are as bad as Hinata when she gets clingy. Running from her isn't easy either." They laughed a little and I frowned and sighed, resting my arm on the now destroyed swords. I was glad to finally be tall enough to wear them on my side. I glared at Yui and tapped my melted swords. She laughed as she looked at me. Yeah, sorry I didn't mean to fireball them. I huffed before I stood up. If I had enough talent with armament hockey I could have coated my swords, they'd have been fine. I need new swords since I only just started to learn ninjutsu, so all I have is my taijutsu and what little armament hockey I can use. I heard Anko laugh a little as we started to walk again. Please, your Crimson Maelstrom Fist has quickly become a very powerful and coveted style. A lot of my class has tried to get your gramps to teach them. Some shinobi and civilian clans are also trying to get him to teach their heirs. I laughed as we walked. Yeah, Gramps doesn't seem to want to have to deal with many people around the village. I think the only ones he really deals with besides us, Tsunade and Shizune Gramps, only talk to Gigi and Tsum. We walked up the road and I sighed as I walked. I stopped as we neared the gate. Naruto-kun. I slowly started to move for the tree line. Naruto-kun. I jumped up, stuck to the tree, and looked down at an annoyed Hinata and a beaten and bruised fourth-year girl. I sighed before glaring at Hinata before she could jump up to me. She stopped and blinked as she looked at me. Naruto-kun. I took a deep breath, then jumped down and landed a few feet away from her. Hinata, I already got onto Yui and Anko for what they've been doing. I'm sick of being treated like a kami-damn object. Hinata flinched since I'd never yelled at her before. Then a blush crossed her face as she looked up at me. I huffed before I jumped away from them all. Naruto-kun, wait, please. I ignored Hinata's yell as I tree jumped like Gramps had shown me. I reached the wall after a few minutes but stopped, then sensed someone come up fast. I turned in the air and slammed into the tree trunk with a kunai in hand. I looked back and saw a plain-masked Anbu. I could sense him, but he had no emotions to him. Naruto Uzumaki, please come with me. I narrowed my eyes as I looked at the man. I flared my haki and covered both hands in armament haki. The knuckles and tops of my fingers on both hands flashed red and faded to black as I looked at him. No thanks. I pulled another kunai when he reached for his sword. I jumped at him as he pulled his sword. I landed below him and blocked a sword strike. I used Soru and got behind him. I punched him in the back hard. I felt his under armor give way as he was thrown to the ground. He slammed down, and I jumped down, aiming for his back. I slammed a knee into his back, and he cried out before I spun a kunai and buried the back end of my kunai into the back of his neck. He passed out, and I sighed. Naruto. I looked to the side and saw Gramps and Swan coming fast. I stood up and looked at them as they rushed up. Gramps looked shocked as he looked down at me. Naruto, your eyes. I blinked as I looked at Gramps, then looked into my kunai. I saw my eyes were still blue, but had a slit instead of a circle. What is going on with my eyes? I looked back at Gramps as I felt Hinata and the others catching up fast. Gramps looked worried as he looked at me. Naruto, you leave with Tsunade. I feel the others coming, so get going. I nodded before I holstered my other kunai before we took off. As I followed behind Tsunade, I felt Hinata still closing in on us. I sighed, knowing she would keep chasing me if I didn't turn and face her. Tsunade seems Hinata got past Gramps and she's catching up fast. Tsunade turned her head and nodded as we jumped to the ground. A minute or so later, I watch her burst through the trees. He looked at me with a panicked look on her face. Naruto-kun. She quickly rushed over and pulled me into a tight hug. I pushed off and back and she looked me in the eye and gasped as she looked at my eyes. Naruto-kun, your eyes. If Gramps was worried about this I have to come up with something. I should have known this would make her panic. In my panic, I came up with a lie. Don't worry, it seems to be part of my hockey abilities. Something to do with my observation, hockey. Hinata calmed down at that and I felt Tsunade relax as she nodded. Okay, Naruto-kun. But, why did you yell at me? I mean sure I know we were a little rough, but… I glared at her again and she gulped as she looked at me. A little. You all dragged me around half the time. I yelled at her again and she took a step away from me before Tsunade grabbed my ear. Naruto. I know we've raised you better than this. I looked back at Tsunade, a frown on his face. I pulled my ear free as I looked at her. I'm treated like a damn dog or something. Tsunade flinched at my yell. I glared at her for a minute before I jumped off again. Tsunade Pav. I sighed as I watched Naruto jump away. I frowned, but I had seen how the girls were treating him. They did treat him like a toy to fight over. Why, Naruto-kun? I looked back at Hinata and she looked crushed as she looked at the way Naruto had left. I sighed as I looked at the poor girl. I sighed as I walked over, got on my knee, and wrapped my arms around her. She grabbed onto my gambler's coat. Why can't Naruto-kun see that we just do all that stuff is because we just want to be close to him? I sighed as I ran my hand down her back as she tried not to cry. Honey, I know, but you all have been smothering him like his voice didn't matter. You can't be angry when he finally snapped back at all of us. But, he's my first friend, I don't want him to pull away from me. I felt for the poor girl as she tried not to sob into my shoulder. Naruto, I hope you calm down soon. You'll break all their hearts if things stay like this. Academy 3rd year POV. Naruto sat leaning back in his chair, Hinata and Ino beside him. But after the verbal thrashing he lashed out at them with last year, they all backed off. Hinata looked at him out of the corner of her eye and frowned as she looked at his shoulder. Before, she would lay her head on it for the whole day if he'd let her. But now, 2 legendary swords rested on his shoulder with a small black tiger cub in his lap. She thought back to the day Shanks gave Naruto those swords in his family's contract. 6 months ago, Naruto's house. Naruto was sparring against Hinata and Yui. Since his snap at them, his training with them had become much rougher. Before, they'd walk away with just a glancing blow from his wooden swords. Now, they would walk away with a dozen or so bruises that had to be treated by Tsunade. Naruto was still kind to them, but wouldn't tell them what was on his mind anymore. He'd grown to a little cold to everyone. His grandfather had tried to break him out of it, but the backlash had also made him back off. Naruto had made it clear he wanted to be left alone. But, Shanks was a commie damn Uzumaki, leaving family out or alone was not a damn option. As Naruto spared, Shanks walked onto the field with Tsunade at his side, a large summoning scroll in Shanks' good arm. Naruto, you 3 stop for a little while, I got something for you. They all stopped Yui, thankful as she looked at the wooden sword about to strike her stomach again. Hinata sighed as she backed away from her crush and looked longingly at his back. He discarded his orange cloak in favor of a simple white button-up shirt that he left open until the 5th button showed off his chest and the very top of his forming abs. He turned, and you could see his longer spiky blonde hair on his shoulder and slightly going down his back. Naruto sent his wooden swords back into his wrist seals. They walked through the groups of clones training and off the water, and Shanks smiled as he looked at Naruto, hoping this would bring his smile back. Naruto, I've decided to replace your swords and to give you mine and your mother's summoning contract. Hinata and Yui look at Naruto, hoping to see his smile again. They felt their hearts lightly a little as a small smile formed on his face. Shanks and Tsunade smiled seeing that smile. Shanks kneeled down, set them down on the ground, and then unrolled the scroll. All of them looked down and saw only 4 names on the scroll. The first name was Ryuma Uzumaki, and the second was Roger Uzumaki. After Roger was Shanks Uzumaki, and he was red and not black. Naruto looked at the last black one, and he tried his best to hold his tears. Kushina Uzumaki in black. Naruto rubbed his eyes before he looked at his grandfather. How do I sign this? Cut your thumb and sign your name, then cover each of your fingers in blood, then press it to the paper under your name. Naruto nodded before pulling out a kunai, cutting his thumb, and getting on his knees. I wrote my name down quickly and did as his gramps told him. He ran his thumb over his fingers and then pressed his hand to the paper. Naruto stood back up and then looked at his grandfather. He smiled before he bit his thumb, then a seal formed on the top of his hand. They all watched as Shanks kneeled down. Shanks threw his hand down to the ground, and as it hit the ground, Shanks yelled out. Uchiha's no summoning jutsu. An enormous white cloud of smoke. A few seconds passed before a roar rang out, followed by a shockwave slammed into the young teens. Naruto grabbed onto Hinata and Yui. Naruto managed to stick to the ground with his chakra. Hinata and Yui clinged to Naruto, glad he could react fast enough. Once the last of the blast passed them, Hinata and Yui got back onto their feet. They all looked up at a 20 stories tall black tiger. Yui almost fainted, and Hinata hid behind Naruto as the tiger looked down at them. The orange eye locked on them. The tiger raised an eyebrow as it saw Naruto's lock with the mighty summons. Shanks, you have someone with the same look in his eyes Roger and Ryuma did as a young Uzumaki shinobi and a Uzumaki samurai. So, he is the one you're choosing to leave Ryuma's and Odin's legacies in. I can't say I'm not happy, I can sense the willpower coming off him in waves. The feminine took the 3 by surprise as they looked up at her. Shanks laughed as Tsunade looked down at the legendary boss summon not seen for 50 years. The tigers seemed to be about to speak again, for all the leaf ninjas appeared ready for battle. In the front stood all the clan heads with the Nujimins Asuma, Kurenai, Might Guy, and the 2 Anbu captains dog and cat. Behind them stood the Anbu crops with the Hokage and Jiraiya at the very head of the forces. So the leaf Shanks. To think you'd come here of all places. Oh, well. Where you chose to raise a cub is your own choice, I guess. Shanks laughed again before he sat down on the tigress's head. Yeah, but Lady Amya. I need the swords I gave you for safekeeping. Lady Amya laughed a little before she raised her front paw, making all the ninjas ready themselves. But, they stopped as she sat down before slamming her paw down. 3 more puffs of smoke came from the front of her paws. As the smoke, 2 normal-sized golden armored white tigers stood there with a sword on their backs. In front of her paw was a small pup-sized black tiger cub. Vespera, my sweet little cub, you need to wake up. The cub grunted in a young feminine whine before she stood up and stretched around. She shook her body before she sat down and looked at Lady Amiya. Howie. Vespera jumped at the sudden yell before Yui tackled the small cub, with Hinata jumping into the smile pile. Yui pulled Vespera into her chest and Hinata ran her fingers through her back fur. Vespera started to kick her legs as she struggled in Yui's arms. Help. Mother, they're messing up my fur. Lady Amiya started to raise her paw to sweep at the two before Naruto walked over. Yui and Hinata looked at him before he held a hand out. Yui and Hinata gave him the dreaded puppy dog eyes. Naruto held his ground and glared at the two for a second before they gave in, and Yui held Vespera out to him. Naruto took Vespera and put his arms under Vespera. She leaned into his chest and felt the dominant energy coming off him. She purred as she rubbed her head into his chest. Lady Amiya blinked as the ninja around them all relaxed as they watched the show before them. Shanks watched with a smirk on his face, and Tsunade laughed a little as she sat on Shanks' lap. My, Lady Amiya, I guess your heir has taken a liking to my grandson. Lady Amiya hummed as she watched Vespera climb up onto Naruto's shoulder. Vespera rubbed her cheek on Naruto's whisker cheek. She also laughed a little as she saw the looks at the cubs she felt like would try to become the mate with her new summoner. Okay. Everyone, we're here to meet our new summons, and hand his swords to him. Vespera sat down on Naruto's shoulder with her body pressed against Naruto's head. The two armored tigers walked over and Lady Amiya spoke as they sat down, their back facing Naruto. He looked at the two swords. On the right is Shusui. It has a black blade with a reddish-purple reverse wave, Heiman. It had a Kanemoto-like style, and its tsuba has a flower-like edges in the shape of an octofoil. It also has no accessories on the hilt, just wrapped with black silk. Kashira, tsuba, and kajiri end cap are golden, and the sheath is black, decorated with dark red circles, split into even thirds. Naruto grabbed Shusui and set it on his side before he drew the blade, and many of the Anbu got close to see the blade as well. They all thought the blade was beautiful, and a few wondered if they could find one like it. Naruto resheathed the Shusui and then grabbed Enma. Naruto stopped as he felt the sword pulse in his hand. He blinked, then put on Enma on top of Shusui. Black blade Enma has a black blade too, and was a moderately curved Shobuzukuri-style katana. The tsuba is trefoil shaped, and each lobe is holed in the middle and thickly ridged. The tsuka is lacquered solid lilac. But, at one time before behind blacked, it forcefully pulled haki from the former users. Now, it will still forcibly take a large amount each time you use it, but the benefit is the power of your own haki will grow out of need to match the pull. Your bloodline will strengthen several-fold. Now we must return home. I'm sure your grandfather and the former Haki King will explain the rest. All the tigers but Vespera disappeared. Shanks looked at her as she rubbed her head on Naruto's cheek. Vespera, your mother said to leave. Vespera hissed at Shanks, surprising him a little before she spoke. I'm the princess of the tigers. I come and go between the summon and human world as I choice. No, explain before I finish clawing out that eye. Shanks sighed and nodded his head, knowing a tiger never made an empty threat. Both are a masterpiece of the legendary swordsmith Shimotsuki Kazaburo and one of the 21 great grade swords. Enma and Shusui are among the best swords in the world. Kazuki Sukiyaki has described Enma as able to cut through to the bottom of hell. Paralleling Aim no Habakiri, its sister sword being able to slice heaven itself. Kazaburo himself deemed Enma to be his best masterpiece in comparison. The ninja around them looking Naruto in amazement. Two of the most valuable swords in all of the elemental nations were just handed over to a teen. Academy 3rd Pav. Vespera got up and stretched out as Ino and Yui left the room, with Vespera jumping onto the desk. Naruto moved his swords to the other side and grabbed Hinata's arm as she stood up. She upped before Naruto pulled her hard, pulled her into his lap, and wrapped his arm around her waist. Hinata blushed as she felt the muscles under Naruto's open shirt. But, not caring, she leaned back into Naruto's chest, overjoyed at the contact she'd been longing for. Naruto wrapped his other arm around her waist too. Hinata threw her arms back and interlocked her behind Naruto's neck. Naruto rested his head on Hinata's shoulder and she could see a smile on his face. Hinata's smile crept back onto her face as joy filled her heart once again. Naruto-kun, what's going on with you? Naruto laughed as he rubbed her stomach. His smile dropped as he spoke. I was just sick of being smothered by the four of you. I thought if I made you four back off some you'd learn to just give me some breathing room. But, the last few months I've seen you and the others seem depressed. Especially you and Anko. Hinata unlocked her fingers and started to move around. Naruto let her waist, and Hinata turned and got on her knees and looked down at Naruto. Naruto blushed a little as he looked up at Hinata. Hinata blushed before she looked out the window, seeing nobody outside, then looked back at the door to see it was still closed. She smiled before she moved Vespera over a little. Vespera gave her a little growl, but she moved, knowing her friend was finally looking at the girl as a possible mate. Hinata sat down on the desk and grabbed Naruto's shirt and pulled him onto his feet. Hinata. Hinata wrapped her legs around Naruto's waist, locking them in place as she opened to the top of her now slightly tied orange jacket. Naruto blushed as he saw wraps around Hinata's chest. Hinata laughed as she wrapped her arms around his neck again. Yeah, I've been hiding my real breast size. I just wanted to keep wearing this jacket hoping you'd come back around again. Naruto laughed a little before he smiled a little more and put his hands on Hinata's sides. He ran his hands up her side and wrapped his arm around her back. He smiled as he felt her soft long hair. He moved one hand around and ran his fingers through her hair. Hinata was in heaven at this moment. Her Naruto was holding her and she was getting the privet time she'd missed so much. Hinata looked into Naruto's eyes and saw a soft look in those eyes that had become so cold. Hinata moved her hands and placed them on Naruto's cheeks and ran her thumbs over his whisker marks. Naruto shivered and Hinata smiled as she may have just found one of his sensitive spots. Hinata, please stop. Hinata smiled as she felt his shiver as she played with his whisker marks. No, Naruto-kun. You've been very cold to me over the last 6 months. Now, I'm taking the attention I've been wanting and you're going to be a good little fox and let me. Hinata moved one hand from his face and started to run it down his neck before the door slammed open. Naruto pulled Hinata into his chest as they both looked at the door. Hinata saw red when she looked at Kiba and Sasuke. I'm going to kill you too. You just interrupted my first privet time in 6 months with my Naruto-kun. Hinata roared before she shoved Naruto back and grabbed Shusui's handle. Naruto held her for a second, trying to zip her jacket back up and managed it before Hinata broke free and drew Shusui as she charged the two fools who'd interrupted them. Ah. I'm an Uchiha, you can't do this. Kiba's dog Akamaru barked before he jumped off Kiba's head, making a run for it. The two quickly followed as she screamed and cursed at them. Naruto sighed as he sat back down and tried to ignore the semi-hard-on in his pants. Naruto frowned at the fact they were all only 13 and she had all but fucking him in the classroom. Then it hit Naruto that Hinata merrily killed the two of them. Naruto quickly put Shusui's sheath on his side with Emna on the top again. Naruto grabbed Despera as he started to run out of the classroom to try and save the fools. 10 minutes later, third Pav. The clan heads laughed as they walked out of the Akamichi barbecue restaurant with Shanks, Tsunade, and Shizune in the back. Shanks looked at them with a raised eyebrow as he looked at them. Tsunade, Shizune, do you two really think it's things are possible? Tsunade smiled and nodded, wrapping her arm around Shanks' good arm. Yes, I have cells from my grandfather that were taken from one of Orochimaru's labs. I could construct a prosthetic limb with mobility and sensation as well. But I don't know how well your Haki would work with it. Shanks nodded before Tsunade smirked and pulled his arm into her breast more. Besides, I have some of my eggs frozen. Who knows, some more Uzumaki and Senju kids running around could be nice. Shanks nodded before he leaned down a little and gave Tsunade a small kiss before they all heard screaming. Everyone stopped and looked around before Akamaru ran past them with Kiba and Sasuke close behind. They watched the two panicking teens running. Behind them was the rage-filled eyes of Hinata as she swung Shusui at them as she chased them. Tazzing behind her was Naruto, with Despera clinging to his back as he yelled for Hinata to stop. Tsume and Makoto looked on in shock as they watched their kids running away. Hiashi watched in shock as Hinata screamed at them for running her moment with her Naruto-kun. Shanks burst out laughing as Naruto offered Hinata anything and everything if she stopped trying to kill the two idiots. Shizune logged before she spoke up. With what we just saw, I think maybe they walk in on the two before they could have some fun. The Ashi's and Shanks' faces turned white before they took off after the group. Tsunade laughed a little as she watched them running after them. 1 month later. Naruto Pav. I smiled as I laid back on the grass in front of our training pond. Despera was asleep on my left side. Ah. Mercy. I sighed as I heard Hinata go off on Yui and Anko again. I sighed before I leaned up and looked around. Hinata had Anko skipping across the water and Yui struggled to block Hinata's kicks and palm thrusts. I looked over and saw Ino training with Tsunade. Ah. I turned and sighed as I saw Hinata send Anko flying away. She bounced across the water heading for me. I got up from my spot on the ground then jumped onto the and caught her mid-bounce. I laughed as she pushed her headband back up. I smiled down at her and she blushed as she looked at me. I laughed a little before I jumped back, dodging a wave sent by Hinata and Yui clash. I landed in a tree before I jumped back down to the ground. I set her back down and she placed a hand on my chest to steady herself as she got her footing back. Her hand lingered on my chest before we heard Gramps yell out. Everyone, we need to talk. Anko moved her hand and started to run over. I laughed a little before I walked over. What? Hinata yelled and I cringed at her yell. I ran over as Hinata started yelling at Hiashi. No. Hiashi hardened his face as I got up behind her. Hinata. I have let you train with Lord Shanks and Naruto for almost a decade. It's time you learn the final techniques of the Hyuga. You need to learn 8 divination 64 palms and the 28 palms. With your skill, you could even master the trigrams of the 256 palms. Then you have to learn the 8 trigrams. Palm rotation. I stood beside Hinata as she glared at her Hiashi. Hiashi took a step back as if she'd struck him. I wrapped around her waist and she relaxed into my side but kept her glare at her father. Hiashi hardened his face again as he stood straight and looked at us. And that is another thing we need to talk about. Hinata, you've monopolized Naruto's attention for years. Others have come here to train with him and you've taken all that time when you're all here. Did you learn nothing from the 6 months of depression when you all smothered him too much? I felt Hinata stiffen in my arm before she finally broke eye contact with her father. She looked down at the ground and I glared at him. I leaked some of my conqueror's haki and kai, focusing it all on him, and I watched him turn white before Gramps spoke up. Enough Naruto. I blinked and huffed before I cut off both. Hiashi sighed before Anko spoke up. I hate to say this, but he's right. We would like to train with Naruto a little more. Hinata tried to grab at Anko, but I tightened my hold on her. She thrashed in the hold for a second before an idea to stop this. I smirked before sending a weak electro pulse onto her stomach. She stopped dead, then shivered and let out a little groan before I let her go. What was that and why does my chakra feel funny? I laughed a little and rubbed the back of my head. Well, with the chakra control I've learned, thanks to Gramps and Tsunade, I've picked up on some medical and read about electrostimulation. I've been training to use it to stun opponents in a fight. But, I guess I still need more control so I don't affect the chakra network. I just meant to make your body relax so you won't be using chakra or the styles we've taught you. She frowned, but I smiled now I had my chance. Besides, I'd like to make a bet with you. I got her attention, and she nodded. Okay. I smiled before I crossed my arms as I looked at her. If you can master all the techniques your father talked about before graduation I'll any 2 things you want. But if you can't you have to do any 2 things I want. She smiled wide before she looked back at Hiashi. When do we start? Hisashi sighed before nodding to me. Hiashi walked off the porch and put a hand on her shoulder before he shunshined them away. I sighed and dropped to the ground, Yui and Ino behind me. Ami, that girl has a presence. I nodded as I looked over at Yui. No kidding, image having her after you 24/7. She shivered and nodded before Gramps spoke up again. Okay, well, you 4 are free to do and plan as you please for the next year and a half. Tsunade and I are off to see the Hokage and then the hospital to see how the work of a private project of hers. I blinked before it hit me. Oh. Do you mean that project she and Shizune have been working on non-stop for the last month? Gramps nodded before Tsunade let go of his arm and then looked at the girls. You 3 follow me for a few minutes. They all flinched as they looked at her. We all knew what Swan would do if they didn't listen to her. I sighed before Gramps stepped off the porch. He sat down beside me with a smile on his face. He laughed before I pulled out a scroll and held it for me to take. I took it and set it down on the ground, knowing Gramps wanted to talk. Hiashi and Hinoka will have the same talk with Hinata when she's calm enough. Tsunade, me, and Shizune will be out of the house a lot over the next few weeks. And I've sent it up so when the last month before graduation comes you all will not see each other. There is going to be a large tournament for all the new ninjas in the village. That month will be used to study for the finals. Now, as for the scroll. There is a contraceptive seal for a woman on that scroll. Anko is 18 and the rest of you are about to be 15. We all know what may happen, and with Hinata I'm sure you know what could happen when she learns you're alone at night. I nodded and looked at the scroll. So, are you say we can? Gramps gave me a stern look and I nodded as I picked the scroll up. I put it into my shirt as I stood up and heard footsteps. I looked over and saw all the girls had blushes on their faces. But Anko looked straight at me and was biting her lower lip. Tsunade looked down at me and pulled a box out of her sleeve. I don't want great godchildren around just yet. She threw a wrapped box into my chest and I caught it. I looked at her for a second, then nodded before I slipped it into my shirt with the scroll. Okay, well all that aside I guess we can break all this year and a half for some one-on-one training. So who wanted me to themselves for the rest of the year? He's mine. Anko yelled and threw Naga at me again. Not again. Naga quickly wrapped her now 10-foot body around my body. The sudden weight threw me off and I fell to the ground. She wrapped her body tight around my forearms as she flicked her tongue on my cheek a few times before Anko jumped off the side of the porch and grabbed my shirt. As she dragged me, I saw Vespera still asleep. Vespera. I saw her head shoot up and she looked over at me as Anko dragged me towards the gate. Anko. Let my clan's newest summoner go. Shut up you furball. Vespera started to run after us and she was faster than Anko. Vespera caught up to us and jumped onto my chest and hissed at Naga as she snapped at her. Let him go. Despera jumped over Naga to try to bite her. She landed on Anko's back and dug her claws into her overcoat. He pulled herself up and bit down on her neck and she screamed as she tried to pull her off. I smiled and used the body replacement jutsu. I stood up as Naga hissed at the sudden cold metal box. Naruto. Get her off of me. Despera, come here. Despera let her neck go and jumped off her. I jumped forward and caught her before she could hit the ground. I looked back at Anko as she rubbed the back of her neck. I blinked as I looked at her neck and saw 3 tomos right at the bottom to the right of her neck. I put Despera on my shoulder, walked up behind her, grabbed her coat and pulled it off the top right side of her overcoat. I looked at it before a second and wrapped an arm around Anko's stomach and forearm, keeping her in place as she yelled for me to let her go. When I let go, she turned and looked at me and I locked eyes with her. Naruto, please, I know I didn't tell you, but I didn't want you to abandon me like a lot of others have. I know that I should. I crossed my arms as I looked at her. She stopped when I put a hand up and looked ready to run. You know my Gramps is a seal master and has been teaching about seals, right? I'm a level 7 seal master and removing a curse mark is something we could do, right? Anko blinked as she looked at me and I laughed a little before I walked over and fixed her coat. I blinked before I tapped her shoulder a few times before she grabbed my shirt and slammed me against the wall. Despera hissed as she was thrown from my shoulder. Anko pressed her body into mine and I blushed as her breast pressed against my chest. I quickly realized she wasn't wearing a bra. You mean to tell me you two could get it off? I laughed before I put my hands up. Well, we'd need to look at the inner working of the cruise mark and see how many levels of the seals we're dealing with. We need to have an idea of what we're dealing with. Does it increase your physical abilities? What about increased stamina? Body alterations or any other number of things? Anko smiled as she looked at me, then her smile got darker. Naruto, you're 10 days away from 15, right? I laughed and nodded as I looked at her. Yeah, but why don't we go get some dango and just calm down? Her smile widened as she got closer to my face. We'll get some later, you may get to put that contraceptive seal on me. I heard from Lady Tsunade that the Uzumaki clan were known as stamina monsters in both chakra and physical stamina. I flinched as she raised a hand and I readied for the shunshin. A second later, we were in a nice looking living room. Anko let me go and I fell back in a chair. Shusui and Enma's handles slapped against my stomach when I landed. Haga slid off my body and off the chair. I groaned as I leaned back up before I felt Anko pull them off my stomach and off my side. Hey. Be quiet, little foxy-kun. I blushed as she threw them onto the couch next to the chair. She moved her arms and shoulders back and her overcoat fell off her, leaving her in a new see-through set of chainmail and her burnt orange skirt. She kicked her sandals and then unstrapped her shin guards. She smiled down at me with a blush on her face as she pulled on the strap on her skirt. It dropped to the ground and I looked at a pair of dark purple panties with lace on the sides. Damn, Anko. Oh, wait until we start the real fun. She grabbed my shirt and then pulled me out of the chair. Anko, I don't think this is the smartest thing to do. You just became a Takubetsujinin, so maybe we should be training. She smiled before she pulled me closer and pressed her lips to mine. I blushed before I wrapped my arms around her waist. Anko opened her mouth and bit down on my lower lips. I opened my mouth and she med before she pressed more into me and wrapped her right leg around mine. Her tongue met mine. It felt strange at first, but I liked it. I ran my hands lower and stopped on her hips. I pressed my hands down on them and felt just a little give. I used my electro-pulse and Anko shivered. She moaned and broke our kiss. She looked at me with a glazed over look in her eyes. Can you try that out on my tits? My face felt like it was on fire when I looked down at her breast. I nodded my head before an evil idea ran through my mind. I slowly ran my hand up her body, sending small electro-pulses into her body as I moved my hand. She shivered as my hand traveled over her body. When I reached her breast, Anko was drooling and I felt something wet on my leg. I looked down and saw her panties had a fast-growing wet spot. I knew what that meant and I smiled as an even more evil idea came to mind. I cupped Anko's left breast for a few seconds before I let her go as her eyes started to come out of her haze. I charged a little bit more of a powerful electric charge. I threw my hand down, slipped my hand into her panties and forced her into another kiss as she screamed and I felt my hand get covered in her fluids. Ah. She went limp into my chest, breaking our kiss as she breathed into my chest. I smiled and pulled my hand out of her panties and was about to wipe my hand off on my pants. Anko grabbed my wrist. She slipped it back into her panties and covered the top of my hand with hers. I blushed as I felt all the heat on my hand. She rested her chin on my chest as she rested on my chest. This is yours and my body are yours, Naruto-kun. Whenever and wherever you want. I blushed, fully understanding what she meant. Anko, I can't treat you like that. And what if Hinata, Yui and Ino find out about this? She smiled before shoving me back and we fell into the chair. She pulled the lever and I flew back, not realizing this was a recliner. Anko laughed as she laid on my chest. Anko let my hand go and I pulled my hand out as she spoke. I don't mind sharing, and seeing as you and Gramps are the last two with a bloodline you could be put in the craw. The minimum number of girls you'd have to pick is 5, so counting me, Yui, Hinata and Ino, you just need to find one more so the elder can't force someone onto you. I nodded, then sighed. Well, we just have to get them on board with the idea. But, you know, Hinata may lose her cool. Anko laughed as she laid there. If you do what you just did to me to her, then I think she'll be fine with it. I laughed as I wrapped my arms around her lower back. Whatever you saw, Anko Haim. She laughed as she slammed my chest. After I get the feeling in my legs back, we'll go and get some dango and head off to my private training area. Okay, and you know, if everything goes well, that the finals at the end of the academy next year I'll be on a team with either Yui or Hinata, seeing as they both are in the lead for Kunoichi of the Year. Much like you got when you graduated as Kunoichi of the Year. Haha, I loved the look on those little bitches' faces when they cried out at the teachers. She sat on my lap and started waving her hands around a little. No, the snake whore is the Kunoichi of the Year. Or kill the cheating snake bitch. I still can get over the hell you unleashed that day. The looks we got as I dragged you off to get dango with my first C-rank pay. My blood boiled at remembering that day. A year and a half ago, Naruto's POV. Naruto smiled as he watched Anko own another Kunoichi. Winner Anko Mitarashi. I smiled as Anko threw her fist into the air. You can't allow this. I looked to the left and saw a girl from a citizen clan cried out. She was a girl Anko had rolled over in the opening round. I watched as others started crying out for them to disqualify her for cheating somehow. She's the snake's whore. She must have cheated. Kill that damn snake bitch already. Anko looked down and I saw tears starting to fill the edge of her eyes. A group of new genin boys jumps down into the arena. I narrowed my eyes before I stood holding my swords. Naruto, wait. I jumped down, ignoring Tsunade, and landed between Anko and the fool surrounding her. Move, Brett. I looked up at the Chunin who was talking to me. He was a Chunin I didn't recognize and I hummed as I drew Shusui and rested it on my shoulder as many in the stand started to yell. Kill them both. Kill the snake whore and the demon. The demon. I smiled before I felt Gramps' hockey blast across the stands. Everyone yelling was down and I smiled as I looked at the now scared genin and the Chunin. I tapped Shusui on my shoulder a few times as I looked at the Chunin. So, who wants to be cutter beaten first? The new genin charged me and I laughed as I turned and swung Shusui to the side infused with wind chakra. I sent a blast of weak air blade at them. The genins couldn't dodge as the blade, but the Chunin managed to jump away before the genins got hit with the attack. They all flew back and slammed into the walls and slid down. My attack had cut up their clothes and a few had shallow cuts on their chest or their arms when they tried to protect themselves. Damn you. I jumped up as the Chunin tried to grab my feet. Anko, jump. Right. I smirked, sheathing Shusui as I threw my right leg above my head. Crimson style. Battle axe water breaker. I coated my leg with haki and smiled as I charged water charka around my leg. I slammed back into the ground and onto the arena floor and onto the walls. A second water-like shockwave follows, shattering the floor. The genin slammed back into the wall again and I smiled as I looked down at the arm sticking out of the ground. I could still sense that his life force was still strong. I leaned down, grabbed his arm and pulled him out of the ground. It looked like my attack had done so real damage but not life-threatening. He had blood coming from his mouth and head. I shook him a little and he groaned and opened his left eye. I pulled him closer and spoke low. Next time I'll finish this, so don't let this happen again. I dropped him and turned to look at a stunted Anko. Damn Naruto. I smiled before I looked up at the judge's box. I saw the ninja judges flinch as I looked at them. Come down here with her ward before I come and take it. One of them quickly grabbed something and then jumped down. She was a younger woman with brown hair and green eyes. She was dressed in a standard outfit for a Chunin. Here you go, Anko. I smiled as she held the certificate and a C-rank pay scroll. I smiled before Anko looked between her and me. I blinked and knew what was coming when I saw that smile. Crap. I turned and tried to run, but Naga quickly wrapped herself in my chest again. She flicked her tongue on my cheek a few times and I sighed as I heard Gramps busting a gut as he laughed. I also heard Hinata yelling for Yui and Ino to let her go. I sighed as Anko grabbed my shirt and started to drag me again. Did the dango stand? I looked up at the stands and frowned as I saw him and Tsunade still laughing while Hinata was being held back with ninja wire by Yui. I looked at the other people and cracked a smile as I looked at the shock and awe on their faces. Naruto current POV. I frowned, but Anko leaned down and cupped my checks. Hey now. I know that look, you need to calm down, Naruto. You won, they lost, it's over. I sighed and I rested my hands on her thighs. You're too nice to me. She smirked before she moved around and laid down on my chest. Her breast pressed into my chest and she crossed her arms under her chin. I smiled, then wrapped my arms around her back and she smiled as she looked at me. You know, I won't mind if you stayed the night, or maybe I could come stay with you. I smiled before kissing her again and she hummed before she moved again. She broke the kiss and sat up on my lap again. Okay, this is happening, so get in that bedroom and strip. She jumped off me and shook her butt as she looked back at me. She quickly rushed to a door and opened it. I blinked and smiled before I got out of the chair and pulled a scroll and box out of my shirt. I threw them onto the couch and pulled my shirt off. I kicked my sandals off and stayed in my pants and grabbed the scroll. I rushed into the door and blushed as I looked at the nude Anko with her hair down. Anko had sat herself up at the head of the bed and smiled as she pulled on the soaked panties as she looked at me. Oh? So you finally have abs and that chest and your shoulders. I looked at her and saw she had a flat stomach with the beginnings of abs on her. I smiled and walked over and unrolled the scroll in my hand. There were a dozen seals and I saw the construction was perfect. I laughed as it would active as soon as it was placed on a female chakra system. I covered my hand in chakra and placed it over one of the seals. I flinched as I felt the sting from the ink moving to my hand. You okay, Naruto-kun? I nodded as I looked over at her. I'm fine, it's just the chakra and the ink burns a little, it sting a little. It will active when I place it on you, and I guess we just place it on your lower stomach. I walked over and then pressed my hand to her lower stomach. Anko hissed and she grabbed my hand before I pulled my hand back. The black ink flashed before it turned white. Why did it turn white? She grabbed me and jerked me down to the bed. I pulled her up my body and she smiled before she cupped my face. I smiled before smiling and laid my arm across her back. This was nice, but I think maybe you'd find my room more comfortable. I know none of you have been in there, plus no snakes watching us. Or the pervert who's been sitting outside the window near the end. Her face turned red before she shot up, covered her, and glared at the window. Leave now before peel your beep like a banana. I laughed before I felt Uriah run like a bat out of hell. I smirked before I grabbed Anko's thighs and sat up. I stood up and Anko wrapped her arms around my neck and wrapped her legs around my waist. She smiled and leaned back and looked at me with a smirk on her face. So? Round 2. I laughed before I patted her thigh. Get changed and we'll get some dango and go pervert hunting. I got a feel for the pervert's location. Anko smiled as she looked at me. I love you, Foxy-kun. I laughed before I ran my hand up her side as she got onto her feet. I cupped her cheek when I touched her face and pulled her into another soft kiss. She leaned into the kiss and she started to bite down on my lower lip again. I pulled back and rubbed my thumb on her cheek. Now Anko, we've played enough for now. Plus, you still owe me the reward you never gave me for holding out against Hiashi. Oh? I think maybe I could help with that before too long. I smiled before I ran a finger from her cheek to her lips and down to her chin. I can think of a few things you could do, but not until we have the others on board with the craw. But I'm still more than happy to give you some fun to keep you calm and happy, my snake goddess. I laughed a little as she turned red. I smiled before I ran my hand along her jaw, then ran it down her neck and stopped as I reached her side. She grabbed my free hand, then moved it back up and pressed my hand to the center of her chest. I could feel her heart through her chest and smiled as she pressed down on my hand. It's yours, you're the only man I'll ever let see me like this. You're the only one I'll ever let touch me like this. I smiled, moved my other hand from her cheek, pulled her headband down, let it fall to her neck, and then pressed our foreheads together. Thank you, my snake goddess. She laughed and pressed her body to mine. I laughed and felt like she was like Naga wanting to cling to me. Okay, really Anko, get dressed and let's go get some dango. No. I don't want to let go of my cute little Foxy-kun. I smirked before I let her side go, then used my water chakra and pulled water out of the air. When I had a little in I smiled before I chilled it with my wind chakra. I raised my hand, then turned my hand and let it fall onto her ass. Ah. Anko screamed and jumped away from me and grabbed the back of her butt. Her face was bright red and I laughed a little before I grabbed my pants and boxers. Get dressed. I'll be waiting outside. I quickly moved as she started to yell. Damn it, Naruto. Shanks Pav. I sighed as I watched Anko dragging my grandson off. The sparrow would most likely going to be held in a snake stranglehold by one of Anko's snakes. Shouldn't you two try to stop her? I looked over at the still flustered Yui and Ino. Do either of you feel like trying to stop her? I don't feel like being attacked by snakes. Besides, we all saw that look in her eyes. She's not going to hurt Naruto, well, maybe make him limp for a day or so, but he'll be fine. Tsunade laughed and I smirked at the blush on their faces. I sighed before I stood up and looked at everyone. Okay girls, you two need to go home for now. Shizune, if you wouldn't mind, could you stay and watch the house with Maya and Ima? Shizune smiled and gave me a small bow before she walked over and held a scroll. This scroll was delivered to the gate earlier this morning. I smiled as I took the scroll. Thank you, Shizune. I pulled out one of the money scrolls I had on me. This scroll had 60,000 ryo sealed inside. I keep on me. Here, Shizune. This scroll has 60,000 ryo in it. Why don't you order out? We'll be gone for a long time, so why don't you order some gourmet food for all of you? She smiled and bowed before taking the scroll and rushing back inside. You know, she and I are grateful for this life, Shanks. I smiled and nodded before I turned and took Tsunade's hand. Come on, I'm sure the old man is freaking out about why we set up a meeting with him the formal way. Tsunade hummed as we started to walk. I still don't understand why you're going to talk to him about this. Why build Naruto a house? This one is more than big enough. I smiled before I looked down at her. Well, if we are going to try and have our own little one, I think it's best if Naruto has his own space. Plus, I've seen how Shizune looks at him. She's only 8 years older than him. You never know what could happen if we have her stay in his house. Haha, Shanks, please don't torture my student like that. Ah. I blinked knowing that yell and hiss. I looked up wall and saw Vespera hissing down at a few larger cats. Vespera. She looked over at me and frowned before she ran over the wall and then jumped onto my shoulder. Where is Naruto? She hissed before she spoke again. That snake woman took him. She said something about a seal and getting to use it. I froze and groaned before Tsunade squeezed my hand. Looks like you were right. Anko or Hinata were the two you were scared would jump him. Looks like Anko was the one. So I won my bet with Mayu and Ima, so I'm scared something is going to happen now. I knew what she meant and I was a little scared about that too. 1 month. Naruto groaned before his eyes opened and looked up at his ceiling. He blinked a few times before he noticed the weight on his chest. And he felt something warm pressed into his side. Naruto looked down and smiled, seeing Anko asleep on his chest. Anko was naked as the day she was born. Naruto looked down to his side and saw Naga and Vespera lying next to him. He smiled before he sighed and knew they had to get up. Anko needed to work on her control before heading off to the tea building, and he had to get to class. Naruto patted Anko's shoulder and she groaned before moving around on his chest. Let me sleep, Naruto. Naruto laughed before he lifted his hand on her back. Okay then, water it is. Naruto let the water fall on her back and she yelped, making Naga and Vespera jump up. Anko shot up and had her chest covered. What the hell, Naruto? Naruto slipped out of the bed and was in front of his standing closet. His sleep pants were black with gray stripes going down his legs. Naruto put on a black tank top before dodging a kunai thrown by Anko. Stay still. I'll be on the pond, Anko. Naruto jumped out his open window and Vespera jumped onto Naruto's back, claws hanging on. Naruto landed on the roof and then jumped again. He flipped in the air and landed on the water. Naruto laughed as he heard Anko going crazy. Vespera yawned as she rubbed her face on my cheek. Naruto, why has she been clinging to you the last few days? Naruto sighed before he reached up and rubbed Vespera's head. Well, you see, she and I have come real close. I think you know what I mean given how strong your sense of smell is. Vespera smirked as she swayed her tail. Yeah, and you're right, Naruto. I can smell her all over you. You know that when Hinata finds out about that happened, you're dead. Naruto gulped before he jumped to the side, dodging Anko's drop kick. Anko had dressed in a pair of tight shorts and a tight purple tank top. Naruto slid across the surface of the water, dodging kunai and shuriken. Vespera clung to Naruto's shirt as he moved around. Naruto, make your tigress stop. I hummed as I jumped off the water and landed on a tree branch. Naruto watched Anko look around, trying to find him. He smiled before jumping around in the trees until he was behind her. Naruto jumped out onto the water and wrapped his arms around Anko's waist. Anko jumped and huffed as she leaned back into Naruto's chest. Damn it, Naruto. Naruto laughed a little as Vespera pawed at Anko's hair bun. Anko nodded her head before Naruto looked down at Vespera. She stopped pawing at the bun and jumped off Naruto's shoulder and landed in the water. I'm going to find some breakfast, Naruto. Naruto nodded as Vespera ran off. Naruto smiled as Anko rubbed her hand on his forearm. You're so lucky, you're a good fuck, Naruto. Naruto laughed a little more before he felt two people coming. People are coming this way. They broke apart fast and Anko turned, trying to land a kick as Yui and Ino walked through the front gate. Yui and Ino watched as Naruto pushed the punch aside, grabbed her arm, then pulled her forward. Naruto went in for a palm thrust he used to line up to finish a fight. Anko used the substitution jutsu and Naruto looked at the trees and dodged another storm of shuriken. Damn, those two are really going at it. Ino nodded as she watched Naruto jump into the trees. But it's weird to see him without his swords. Yui nodded before they heard Anko screaming before she was thrown out of the trees and rolled across the ground. Oh, those two have been at each for a while now. Yui and Ino looked down at the sparrow as she chewed on a dead rabbit's leg. Ino turned a little green and Yui sighed as she looked back at the fight. Naruto dominated the fight and had complete control of the pace and speed. Yui, do you think we could get in on the combat training? I flinched as Anko landed a punch on Naruto's face. But Naruto countered with a low blow to her side. Anko was forced back and Yui felt slightly angry that now another woman had all of Naruto's attention. Yeah, I got a way to make sure we can. Ino looked at Yui before Yui cracked her knuckles and looked at Ino. We both want time with him too. So, why not just drop in on them? In our world you never know when more enemies will jump in. Ino smiled at Yui's idea and they rushed over to the pond. Ino pulled out 2 kunai and Yui started to weave hand signs. Horse, tiger, serpent, ram, monkey, boar, horse, tiger. Ino jumped at Naruto's back, forcing him to jump out from between Anko and Ino. Yui got above Naruto as he landed near the pond's edge and looked up. Pain. Pankakik no jutsu, great fireball jutsu. Naruto ran through hand signs and then threw his head back as water filled his mouth. Suiten no jutsu. Water formation wall. The 2 jutsu collided and steam erupted from the impact. Anko, Ino and Yui were surprised to see Naruto pulling off an air-rank defensive jutsu like it was nothing. Yui started to fall and she had her 2 Tomo Sharingan active and cursed her lack of water affinity. Yui landed and got grabbed from behind by one of Anko's snakes. Anko pulled her back as Naruto came out from the pond, trying to grab Yui. Anko sent her down between herself and Ino. The 3 looked at Naruto as he pulled himself out of the water. Not a bad idea. Force me out with a pincer attack, then come at me from above. But all that aside, why are you 2 here? We have to go to the academy today and coming here takes you far from that route. Yui and Ino smiled as they looked at Naruto. Anko frowned as she looked between the 2 girls. Naruto laughed before I turned and looked at the house. Anko, you and I need to finish our spar, then get changed for work in the academy. Anko sighed before she spoke up. No, these 2 have ruined our tempo, Naruto. Naruto looked back at Anko, eyebrow raised. Yui and Ino looked at her raised eyebrows. Anko looked between the 3. Anko never talks like that, who are you? Naruto laughed a little as Yui spoke. Anko glared at her before she looked back at Naruto. And I don't think you need to get changed. Hell, all you need is your swords and sandals. Naruto nodded before he tensed up as Hinata appeared on the pond, Hanabi at her side. Naruto looked at them, his eyes widened as he looked at them. The 2 had changed her clothes completely. Hanabi had changed from her bright white kimono and child sandals into a black kimono with red and blue flames at the bottom. She had on knee-high shinobi boots and Naruto could make out her kunai and shuriken holders. Naruto looked at Hinata. Hinata was dressed in a burnt orange top jacket that was open. She wore a dark blue deep-cut v-neck, showing off her full size. She was a little bigger than Anko, making her almost an E-cup. Naruto looked down and saw she had on a skirt that opened on the sides and she'd wrapped her thighs in bandages with holsters on both thighs. Looking lower, Naruto saw clear and flawless skin and she had on heels like Tsunade and Shizune wore. The other girl saw a little blood coming from Naruto's nose. Naruto started to sense the bloodlust and quickly wiped his nose before he looked at Anko. She had a smile on her face and had a kunai in hand before pointing it at her crotch. I need to get my sword. Naruto jumped away, scared out of his mind, not wanting to get his beak cut off. Naruto knew Anko didn't mind sharing, but he also knew this was her time, not Hinata's. Naruto landed on the roof and then hopped back into the room. Naruto sighed before I felt someone right behind him. Naruto turned his hand on Enma's handle. Anko was behind him and had her eyes narrowed as she tapped her foot on the floor. If I remember right, you're mine for another 4 months. Anko took a few steps and Naruto backed up a little. You're supposed to only look at me right now and once the croc kicks in you're free to stare all you want at all of us. Oh, and don't worry, I left a shadow clone with the others before I slipped away. Naruto backed up into the closet. Anko stood right in front of Naruto with that smirk on her face. She wrapped her arms around Naruto's neck and Naruto relaxed, seeing that Anko wasn't going to kill him yet. Naruto wrapped his arms around Anko's lower back. Anko ran her hands up Naruto's chest and cupped Naruto's cheek. You look at her like that again in my 4 months, and I'll make you pay. Naruto laughed before a crash was heard outside. They broke apart and Anko dashed out the door as Naruto jumped back out onto the roof. He looked down and saw the pond closing back up. He sighed as he saw the real Anko come back out in new clothes a minute later. Anko wore a pair of thigh-length tore shorts with black stockings and blue ninja sandals. Anko had on a tightly wrapped purple and black battle kimono. She had her hair pulled back. Naruto saw Hinata with a mad look on her face. Naruto looked around as Yui and Ino climbing out of the water. Naruto jumped down onto the pond, put 2 fingers into his mouth, and then let out a whistle. Everyone looked at him before he clapped his hands. Okay, everyone, we need to head out. Hinata, Yui, Ino, and Hanabi, you guys head off to the academy. I'm running off to the weapons shop before coming to the academy. Anko, you and I are going the same way since you need to got to work. I can use Soru to get you there on the way. Anko smiled before she walked over and wrapped an arm around his arm before the two vanished in a blur. Hinata and Hanabi used their Byakugan to watch Naruto as he and Anko rushed across the building roofs. Hinata was annoyed at the fact she had to share his attention, but she knew in the end, her father and mother were right. If she pressed too hard, she could lose. Hanabi smiled as she watched Naruto and Anko as they got out of range of her Byakugan. She had a pretty good idea of what was going on and she felt her sister would lose it when she figured it out. Naruto's POV. I landed outside of the T building and Anko sighed as she held onto my arms. I looked around and glared at the civilians around us. All of them backed away and I huffed before I nudged Anko with my shoulder. She laughed before she kissed my cheek and let me go. I grabbed her arm and then pulled her into a kiss. She hummed as she wrapped her arms around my neck. After a second, Anko broke the kiss. I sensed the disgust of the villagers, but I didn't give a damn. I love how pissed they all look. I smiled as I rested on her side as felt a shinobi above us. Seems like someone finally found their balls. I gave her one more kiss before I let her go. I'll be back at lunchtime with some dango. Anko smiled before nodding and shunching away. I grabbed my sword before using Soru and got behind a dog mask Anbu. He spun and looked at me with 2 black eye holes. He was tall and dressed in the standard uniform of the Anbu Corps. I saw the tattoo on his arm and knew he was a captain. What stood out the most was his grey gravity-defying hair. I guess I'm getting rusty, seeing that you sensed me out so quickly. I nodded before I pulled my swords off my side and sat down. One of my bloodline abilities lets me sense when someone nearby can help me dodge attacks. And, once I unlock the advanced form I'll be able to do what the Sharingan is rumored to do. My gramps told me when it's at the highest level he can see 10 seconds into the future. As a fellow ninja, you know as well as I do that every second counts. He was quiet for a minute before he laughed a little. I like you, kid. You take this life seriously and understand even while not being a ninja yet. What other abilities does your bloodline do? I didn't sense any ill intent or hate coming from him. Well, I can harden my body to make any physical attack, weapon, and a few low-level jutsu. The other and most powerful ability is one I don't much care for, but it's very useful. It's called Conqueror's Haki or the Sing's Will, whichever you prefer. If your willpower is weaker than mine I can force them into unconsciousness. But, I hate to use a power that forces others to submit to me. Again he was quiet before he sat down and crossed his legs as he looked at me. Hey kid, if you had a choice between finishing a mission or saving your comrades, which would you pick? I looked at him for a second, then laughed a little. I felt a little worry creep into him. I stood up and put my swords back on my sides. My friends and comrades. To hell with the mission. If I have to sacrifice my reputation and pay to save someone I care about, I'll do it every time. I learned that by studying the White Fang of the Leaf, a true hero of the Leaf Village. He should have lived a long life, not ended it thinking he failed. When I have a team of my own I refuse to become scum who abandons them. I felt his emotions running wild as I looked at him. But, I turned as I felt him fill with gratitude and pride. Wait. I turned back and saw him holding a hand out to me on his feet. Yes. I swear I could feel his smile as he looked at me. I have a friend who would love to meet and train someone like you. Tell me, what is your name and what is your affinity do you have? I looked at the man for a moment thinking over this man's offer. Naruto Uzumaki, and I have lightning, water, and wind. I have high affinity in all 3. I felt the shock coming from him before I grabbed hold of my swords. I'm sure I'll see you again very soon, dog. I used Soru and landed back down on the ground down the road and smiled as I saw the weapons shop and looked up at the sign. Higurashi's weapons shop. Why does that name sound familiar? I opened the door and looking the show and saw a large, well-muscled man leaning back into a chair with an orange book in hand and had a smile on his face and was giggling as he read. I hummed as I looked around the shop and smiled when I saw the large scrolls I was looking for. As I walked over, I saw the man look up out of the corner of my eye. His eye widened before he set the book down. Hey, you're the Uzumaki heir. I nodded as I grabbed the large scroll and 2 scroll hip holsters and 2 scrolls a quarter the size of the large scroll I had plans for. You must be Shanks' grandson. He knows Gramps. I looked at him as I set the holsters and scrolls down on the counter. You know my Gramps. He smiled as he looked at me. Yeah, he's given me a few seals I need in exchange for discounts on scroll and chakra ink. And if you want that massive sealing scroll you need a shoulder holster to hold it to your back or a belt holster keeping on your lower back. I nodded before I heard a girlish scream. I jumped to the side, making a girl miss a jump at me. I held onto my swords. I looked down at a girl with black hair and grey eyes. She wore her hair in two Chinese-style buns on her head, with short bangs framing her face. She wore a pink sleeveless kipao-style blouse with red sleeve trimmings, yellow fastening buttons, and dark green pants. I saw a headband on her head and a scroll patch on her thigh. I backed away a bit as she turned, and I saw her staring straight at my swords. Those are two of the 21 greater grade blades. Shusui and Enma. I blinked and laughed a little as I looked at her. Oh, you just wanted to get a look at my swords. Well, if you'd like, I'll let you see them. The man sighed as the girl quickly rushed up, hands clasped as she looked up at me. Yes. I laughed as I waved my hand down at her. I pulled Shusui and Enma out of their sheaths and held them out to her. She quickly took them from my hands and looked up at them with stars in her eyes. I laughed and left her to admire as I pulled out my swirl wallet and pulled out the new debit card Gramps had finally gotten from the bank. He smiled and took it from me and set his book down. He stood up and I hummed as I saw he was just an inch or two shorter than Gramps. He was also built like a mountain. I tapped my foot on the ground a few times before the girl started to talk to me. Hey, you're that Naruto kid, right? I turned and she smiled as she held the swords back out to me. I smiled and grabbed the handles. I resheathed them and smiled as I looked at her. Yeah, I'm Naruto Uzumaki, and you with those pretty little eyes. She blushed and smiled before she looked away from me. Tenten Higurashi. I smiled and grabbed one of her hands that we were playing with the bottom of her blouse. I pulled her hand up to my face and pushed my hair up and gave her hand a quick kiss. She turned red as I looked at her. Uzumaki. I leaned back and a kunai flew past where my head was a second ago. I smiled as I leaned forward and looked at the raging man. What? Can't I show a beautiful flower some affection? Tenten leapt before running behind the counter, red as it could be. And hid behind the angry man. I quickly dodged another kunai and sword before he threw a sealed scroll and the debit card at me. I ran around for a minute, watching him lose his mind. I snagged his book without him seeing it, then sealed it into my wrist seal. Take your stuff and leave my family's shop. I smiled as I caught both. Oh, so that bombshell-to-be is your daughter. Nice to know, see you again soon, Tenten-chan. Out. He rushed around and smiled at the completely red girl looking at me. I jumped to the door dodging a grab and kicked it open before running down the road. I could hear the man after me. Don't come near my daughter again, you damn Uzumaki playboy. I laughed as I ran, knowing I could get away whenever I wanted. Third Pav. Naruto, having lost the enraged father. He walked into the classroom humming as he walked to the front and smiled, seeing Hinata and Ino waiting for him holding a seat. Naruto was Yui having a quiet fight with Sasuke in the back. He saw Sasuke pull his hand back like he was about to strike Yui. Frowning as he looked at him, Naruto used Soru and was behind Sasuke and grabbed his forearm. Naruto grabbed the back of Sasuke's shorts and pulled Sasuke up onto his totes, and you could tell his balls were being crushed by his own weight. Naruto walked him back to his seat like a whipped puppy. Sit down and shut up, you disgrace. Naruto forced Sasuke to sit down before grabbing the back of Sasuke's head and slamming him face first into the desk. Naruto huffed as he looked down at the knocked out fool he'd once again put in his place. Naruto let his hair go, then walked back down at a laughing Hinata and Ino. Yui walked down behind Naruto, a smile on her face as she sat down behind Naruto. Naruto sealed his swords away, and Hinata smiled as she laid her head on Naruto's shoulder. She wrapped her arm around Naruto's and sighed as she held onto him. Ino leaned into Naruto's other side, happy to feel the warmth of Naruto's body. As the class started, Naruto's thoughts drifted back to Anko. They'd been fucking for a month now, and he wasn't sure what that made them now. Naruto, pay attention. Naruto caught the eraser Iruka threw at him. Ino groaned as she had to move for Naruto to catch the eraser. Iruka sighed before Naruto flicked his wrist. Iruka caught the eraser before turning back around and talking again. Like I was saying. We will be using Toddy in an hour to practice our weapons throwing and to jutsu and giving each of you a chance to show a jutsu you may have learned. And someone wake Sasuke up again. Iruka sighed before talking low, but not enough to stop a few in the front row from hearing. I swear he just needs to leave Naruto alone, he's never going to learn. Naruto smiled at that and Hinata laughed a little as Ino smirked. Naruto laughed a little before he went back to his thoughts about Anko. She came off like for was mad but could be so loving when she wanted to be. She had a soft side to her at times, almost gentle. Naruto's listened to Iruka waiting for lunch. With Anko. Anko sat at her desk, sipping some green tea as she read over the information she'd gotten out of one of the spies from Iowa. Anko sighed as she set the paper down and elbow on the table and rested her chin on her hand. Her mind drifted to Naruto and the last 2 nights. She smiled as her other hand idly moved to her lower stomach where Naruto had placed the seal. She wondered what the future held for her if everything went like she hoped. Anko. Anko jumped as she looked up and saw Shanks at her door, a smile on his face. Anko was shocked to see Shanks. Shanks walked into the room and sat down in the chair across from Anko. Anko smiled as she looked at him and noticed something was happening with Shanks' missing arm. "What's going on with that arm, Shanks?" Shanks smiled before rolling the sleeve up and showing some arm bandages. Tsunade wanted to remove the scar tissue from the burns. With what's going to happen in the next few months. Now, I heard you and Ibiki broke that ninja I caught. I want to know what he gave up. I have the Hokage's seal to let you know I'm cleared to hear everything. Anko nodded, then held her hand out to Shanks. He quickly pulled out a small scroll and handed it over to Anko. She quickly broke the wax seal on the small scroll. She opened it and then looked at the contents. The tea department. From the third Hokage. Sir, Shanks has been granted permission to learn the information gained from the interrogation of the former root shinobi. As the first responding ninja to the Uchiha massacre and as the head of the Uzumaki, he's cleared to know the intel. Side here is in Sarutobi, third Hokage of Konohagakure no Sado. Anko nodded before she stood up from her desk and walked over to the wall. She made a half-tiger sign and flared her chakra. A spot on the wall flashed before a door appeared. Anko opened the door and she was in a room with one of only 8 computers in the building. Anko walked over and quickly typed in her password and ran through a few files and a few more passwords. She had the intel Shanks wanted. She quickly made a copy and printed it off. Anko smiled as she quickly read over the integration notes at the top. Interrogation subject 97,668. It took more than 3 weeks to break through his mental training to resist interrogation. He was, however, broken and given up names as to who was involved and gave up information on plans to retrieve and break the Uzumaki Jinchuriki to be made into a weapon. Anko stopped seeing the word Jinchuriki. She put the strange word aside for now and decided to ask the Hokage. Anko walked back into her office and handed over the paper and he thanked he before he stood and walked out of the office. Anko sighed and hummed as she sat back down in her seat. She looked up at her clock and smiled, seeing that it was lunchtime for the academy. Anko quickly put all the papers away before a knocking came on her door. Her smile widened as she looked at Naruto as he stood there with a bag in hand. "Come in and lock then seal the door." Naruto Pav. I smiled as I walked into Anko's office, locked the door, and placed a chakra blocking seal and a soundproofing seal. I watched Anko stand up as I walked over to her desk and she grabbed my shirt and shoved me into her chair. She took the dango bag and then sat down on my lap. I laughed and wrapped my arms around her waist as she ripped into the bag. "Oh, you got the really good stuff today." I nodded as she moved back, pressing her ass more into my lap. "You really like my ass, don't you?" I groaned as she looked back at me with a dango in her mouth. She moved around a lot more and she grabbed my left hand. She pulled around her body and put it at the edge of her waistband. I smiled as I sent small electroshock to her lower stomach. She shivered as she leaned back into my chest and ate her dango. "Homie, I can't believe how much I love that." Third Pav 10 minutes later. Naruto opened the door and walked out with Anko walked out happily chewing on dango, not minding the sore feeling in her legs. They walked over to the window and Naruto opened the window and put a foot on the windowsill. Anko grab on. Doing what Naruto said, she wrapped her arms around his chest. Naruto wrapped an arm around Anko's back and used the Soru to race across the rooftops heading for the school. Anko smiled as she held onto her lover. After a minute, the two landed in the schoolyard scaring the class as they regathered for the sparring and throwing training. Anko laughed as she held Naruto for a second longer than the 3 girls liked. Ino, Yui, and Hinata walked up to them before Iruka spoke up. "Okay, with Naruto back we're all here. And Anko, why are you here and holding on to Naruto?" Anko made a good show of trying not to get sick. "That stupid high-speed movement flips your stomach. I'd love to see you look fine after being thrown around like that." Iruka seemed to buy it as he spoke. "I see, so like the first time a ninja uses a shunshin technique. I remember throwing up the first time I used it." Hinata grimaced and shivered, knowing that feeling well from both techniques. Naruto helped Anko over to the bench and side before resummoning his swords and put both them on his side as well as a pouch and set it on his side. Naruto walked back over and noticed Kiba and Sasuke glaring at him until Kiba smelled the air. Naruto watched as Kiba sniffed the air a few more times before he was called to throw. Not caring if he was found out, Naruto crossed his arms and waited for his turn. A 15 out of 20 good work, Kiba. "Sasuke, you're up next." Sasuke walked up like he owned the village and his fangirls screamed as they watched Sasuke throw his kunai and shuriken. A 18 out of 20, very good, Sasuke. "Naruto, you're up." Naruto smiled and reached into his pouch, pulling out 1 kunai and 1 shuriken. "Hey dope, what are you doing? You need more than 1 of each." Sasuke frowned as Naruto walked past Sasuke and Kiba but stopped once he was beside the two. I know, but I'm about to do some you two fools can't. Naruto walked up to the like and them both before running through hand signs. Shuriken Shadow Clone Jutsu. The one kunai and shuriken turned into 10 of each and they needed to the target dead center. AA 20 out of 20 incredible work Naruto. Sasuke gritted his teeth and Kiba flashed his fangs before he sniffed again. He looked at Naruto then his mouth dropped open. Naruto turned and raised an eyebrow as Kiba started to yell. I knew I smelled snakes, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It's coming from you. It's like you were in a damn snake pit. Kiba yelled as he pointed at Naruto. Staying calm while freaking out inside from the look Hinata, Ino and Yui were giving him, Naruto spoke. I've been training with Anko for over a month. You try to not smell like the snakes that cling to you for heat. Oh wait, you always smell like dog butt, so why do you care much? Or is it the fact a woman is near me when they run from you? Laughed roared around Kiba as Naruto turned his back and walked back over to the others. Once Naruto was close, Hinata grabbed onto his arm and pressed her body into Naruto's side. She didn't like that Kiba had made it known something must have happened. Hinata didn't like the fact that another woman could be worming her way into her spot as best friend and her place as his future head wife. Hinata was no fool, she knew Naruto was going to be put in the craw like her mother and father said may happen. Even if there were other Uzumaki in the village, Naruto and Shanks were the last two with ninjas in the village with an incredibly powerful bloodline. Shanks couldn't be made to do it. But, the council could use Naruto's young mind to get more Haki users for the village. Yui laughed as she looked at then walked over and grabbed his other arm and pulled it into her smaller cup breast. Yui get away from the dope. Naruto sighed before he turned his head and looked back at the pissed off third Uchiha heir. Naruto remembered the day Yui told him that Mikoto had followed tradition and Yui had beaten Sasuke down, taking the place of the heiress of the Uchiha clan. Sasuke was livid and couldn't expect that he wouldn't be the next clan head. But, he was angry at the fact his sister had all but made it clear Naruto was who she wanted to rebuild the main line. Sasuke hated that more than anything. They all laughed at him for a second before Ino spoke up. Sasuke, you know you should yell at the next clan head like that. Sasuke glared at her and took a step towards her, but stopped when a pressure covered the training area. Iruka and Mizuki felt a shiver go down their spines as they felt the Kai in the air. All around them, ninja hopefuls were falling to the ground out cold. Sasuke dropped to his knees along with the other heirs not close to Naruto, and Anko dropped to the ground. The pressure increased as Naruto turned to make Hinata and Yui let him go. Iruka and Mizuki flinched when they saw the blue slit eyes that looked at Sasuke. Take one step towards anyone I'm close to, I dare you. The beating I'll give you will make what happened to your clan look like an angry kid throwing tantrum. Sasuke started to sweat as he tried to look Naruto in the eye. Sasuke backed down, scared as he looked at Naruto. Naruto then looked at Kiba and he saw Akamaru hiding behind Kiba's legs and Kiba looked ready to piss himself as his instinct screamed alpha as Kiba looked away from the eyes that would strike fear into any Inyazuka, their dogs, and even some wolves. Kiba's pride was screaming for him to glare down these challenger to his place in the pack. But his survival instinct screamed loudly for him to turn and run. Naruto glared at Kiba and Kiba froze when he looked Naruto in the eyes. Sit. Kiba did as he was told, shocking everyone who was still awake as they watched Kiba sit, head bowed to Naruto. Naruto huffed before turning away. The pressure on the air gone once he looked away. Iruka was the first to regain his voice. We're going to end class early today Naruto, you're coming with me, Anko and Mizuki. We're going to see the Hokage. Iruka was doing his best to sound intimating, but he knew just from what happened he knew, even if they tried to fight they'd lose. Iruka knew Anko had been training with Naruto for a few years, so he hoped it would get Naruto to come quietly. Naruto huffed and Anko walked over and put a hand on Naruto's shoulder. Come on Naruto, let's just go and get this over with. Naruto sighed before he wrapped an arm around Anko's shoulder and pulled her tight into his side. Hang on, I'm going full speed this time. Anko made another good show of looking a little scared. They vanished and the ground cracked from the force Naruto used. Hinata tried to follow them, but to her shock, she couldn't, the speed was too great for her eyes to follow. Naruto Pav. I sat in the Hokage's office and looked at the Hokage as he looked back at me. I'll ask again Naruto. Why did Iruka and Mizuki say your eyes turned into slits? I sighed as the Hokage asked this question again. As I told you, Jiji, I don't know why my eyes do that when I get angry that angry. Gramps seems to have an idea, but he's not willing to talk about it. Jiji looked at me for a minute before he sighed and rubbed his eyes. I'm sorry, Naruto, but I must get your grandfather and Tsunade here. Something I've made hidden from you has to come out now. If you are not told about it now, something worse may happen later if you don't know. I raised an eyebrow before I felt an Anbu leave the room. I leaned back into the seat and crossed my arms as I looked at the old man. As we sat there, I remembered the book I snagged. I resumed the book and smiled as I looked at the orange book. Make Out Tactics Book 1. The old man paled as a black flash appeared beside me. Where did you get that? I jumped at Tucson's voice and turned to look at her. An evil idea came to mind as pervert flashed in my mind. Payback time, you peeping Tom. The toad said I could use this with all the girls around me, haven't read it yet. Sure is a strange name for a book though. Tucson's kai was coming off in massive waves and I could feel the anbu from before with a mix of envy and joy. Time to hammer the finally nail. Let's see you do your resource from the hospital. I blinked, then spoke again. Actually he did say something about research and something our house. I hummed before she snatched then ripped it in half with her bare hands. Her anger tripled and Gramps was starting to get pissed too. And let hell will fall on you toad fucker. Tsunade showed a sweet smile to us before she disappeared in a puff of smoke and I smiled and laughed. I held up my fingers and counted down from 5. I watched the two start to sweat and when I had a fist, a scream of utter pain rang out through the village. I smiled as I watched both their faces pale as the screams echoed out. You're evil. I hummed as I looked at Gramps. No, I'm a survivor, would you take that beating? Gramps blinked a few times, then nodded as he looked at Gigi. Gigi nodded as they two looked at one another. Then spoke in unison. Good point. Yes. The pervert is getting the beating he's owned. We all jumped before it the yell, and I sighed as I knew Anko was hearing the cries of pain. I smiled as I leaned back into the chair. Well, Anko is happy. I smiled and laughed a little as Gigi activated a seal. A second later, I couldn't hear anything from the outside. I hummed as I took a quick glance around and I saw seals carved into the walls with faded chakra ink. I also noticed a second layer of suppression seals under them. Those will be a damn headache if he actives them. Naruto. I looked at Gramps as he spoke up. He had a serious look. I gave him my full attention as I rarely saw that look. Gramps sighed before he tapped the desk a few times. Naruto, things have been kept from you. We wanted you to be old enough and have the power to protect yourself. But it's clear the beast is starting to turn its head again. Naruto, do you know about the 9 tails? I nodded as I looked at Gramps and Gigi took over. Naruto, what you were told about the fox was a lie I had put in place. The 4th Hokage didn't kill the beast as it was made of pure chakra. But the beast could be sealed away with a powerful enough seal and a young baby to seal the 9 tails into. And the 9 tail can only be sealed into a baby Uzumaki who was only a few hours old, making him a Jinchuriki. Many people learned of it and I tried to stop them by making a law, but it didn't help any. The adults knew and tried to spread it to the younger generation. I felt my stomach drop as I looked at the two. Then I flared my chakra and ripped my shirt off to try to find the seal. Sure enough, a seal started to show on my stomach and I could tell it was easily a master class seal. I started breathing hard as I stared at the seal and all the names the villagers called me made sense. Naruto. I looked up at Gramps as he reached out to me. I gritted my teeth and then threw my arm up, knocking his arm away. I clenched my fist and teeth as I glared at him. You knew Gramps flinched as I let my haki loose and he looked shocked at the amount as I blasted them with. I knew it was going to put the village on edge, but I didn't care at the moment. You need to calm down before my power comes out. Ignored the voice as I looked at the two but knew it was right. I grabbed my shirt and threw it back on as I got myself back together and turned my back to them. Lord Hokage doesn't call on me again until I'm a ninja and Shanks. I spit his name out and I felt the shock and pain coming off the two in waves. I'm done with your training and you're home. I drew my swords and destroyed the wall, then jumped off the hole. Naruto, wait. Third Pav. Naruto rushed across the rooftops, cracking the rooftops as I jumped. He knew he was faster than Shanks even with that fucking 4th jutsu. But, unknown to him, Anko was near the window and Hinata was walking on the street under the Hokage tower. Yui and Ino were having lunch on the roof of the flower shop. The Anbu captain who talked with him saw him come out of the hole in the wall, with Shanks yelling for him to wait. All 5 started after him, each worried about what had happened. As they all raced across the village, Tsunade came running back to Hokage Tower and saw Shanks just standing there shaking as he looked out to the village. Then she heard what sounded like an expulsion. Tsunade turned and saw a large part of the top of the east gate was destroyed. As she looked, Shanks dropped to his knees, knowing this could happen, but had hoped it wouldn't. Naruto. Naruto Pav. I jumped from the last house at the east gate and coated my right leg in haki. Ah. I kicked the top of the gate. Dust flew up and I landed on the top of the gate, breathing heavily as I looked out at the sea of trees in front of me. I felt a lot of people coming my way and I could feel Hinata, Ino, Yui, Anko, and the Anbu from before. I jumped off the broken gate and used Soru to get into the trees wanting to destroy something. I landed and coated both my arms. I jumped at one of the trees and punched through a tree. I grabbed the tree as it started to fall and slammed it into another 2 trees. It broke as I spun it over my head. I felt the others getting close, but I didn't care as I threw the broken tree away into more trees. Damn it, screw you all. I screamed and coated my leg and kicked a large boulder, breaking it and throwing it away in pieces. I yelled in anger that the fact the man who was the greatest hero of the village had damned me to this fate. I grabbed another tree and ripped it from the ground, then threw the thing in the same direction the others were coming from. Hinata landed first and jumped away as I grabbed a small about the size of a table. I ripped it out of the ground and then chucked the damn thing through the forest. It broke down trees as it flew in the air until it slammed into a cliff wall. I sighed as I looked at the damage I'd done to the forest. Naruto-kun. I turned my head and looked at Hinata out of the corner of my eye. She jumped as she looked at me and turned back to the destruction. Leave all of you. My voice sounded darker as I let my haki fade away. What happened in there, Naruto? I looked back at Anko. That old bastard and Shanks knew why I was hated. They knew why I had to find food and clothes in the trash before Gramps showed up. You had to what? Yui and Hinata yelled, and Ino and Anko looked ready to kill someone. I looked back at the damage I'd done. A year before I met you, I was kicked out of the orphanage. I spent 9 months on the street being attacked by other ninjas and civilians. I didn't understand it at the time. Why was I being attacked by the people and shinobi of this village? And the things that yelled as they chased me around. Fox demon, killer, murderer, devil child. I clenched my fist before 2 sets of arms wrapped around me. I looked down and saw it was Yui's and Ino's arms. I threw my arms up, making them let me go. I grabbed my swords as I felt the Anbu surround us, with Tsunade not too far away, Gramps hot on her heels. We're surrounded. I nodded at Anko's voice and used my thumbs to play with the guard of Shusui. Yep, Anbu, Tsunade, and Gramps are coming too. You 4 have a choice to make: stay here and learn the truth or leave like I'm going to leave the Uzumaki home. What? Hinata yelled as I heard 2 sets of feet land behind us. I hummed before Gramps spoke up. Naruto, I know you're upset, but please, you have to understand. I clicked my thumb up, shutting Gramps up at the sound. I don't care all this time, and you hid that from me. I'm done with both the Hokage and you, Shanks. Naruto, look, your anger, you have the right to be, but nothing, Tsunade. I turned and glared at the 2 before I clicked Shushi back into its sheath. I sensed the Anbu around us getting ready. If I decide it's worth it, I'll spec with you all later. Third Pav. Yui reached out for Naruto before he vanished, and 2 Anbu slammed down to the ground. Both their masks smashed in, and shadows followed after Naruto as he made his way deeper into the forest. Fast behind them all was Anko, Ino, Yui, and Hinata. Shanks and Tsunade frowned as watched this. They knew it could have gone bad, but they'd hoped he'd take it better. After a minute, Shanks and Tsunade were after them. I growled as I felt the others closing in on him, Hinata leading the pack. Hit, use the Soru and get low into the forest. I used to run around these forests before I was sealed. One of my old caves is nearby. I can also hide you from Hinata's eyes for a little while. But your Gramps Haki will still be able to find us. I frowned hearing that but did like the strange soft voice idea. Dealing with just Gramps and Tsunade would be much easier. I jumped off another branch and smiled as I used Sour. I landed and then was covered in a mess of red chakra. It felt like I was being held in hot water but not burning. I felt them all overshot me, and I smiled as I looked around and smiled as I saw a small cave. I held my swords and jumped into the cave. I landed in the middle of a large cavern and sent out a blast of haki. I knew it would bring Gramps down on me faster, but I wanted him here this time. I jumped up and stick to the cave ceiling and waited. So this part ends here. Alright, that's it for today's video, guys. Let me know in the comments section how was the story, and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video. Bye bye.